Hey guys, it's me again. I'm not here to talk about YA today. Instead, I'm here to talk about how my latest nonfiction obsession is all Lin-Manuel Miranda's fault. So I was a latecomer to Hamilton, the musical. I was very late. I resisted and I resisted and I resisted because I was like, listen, y'all keep telling me to listen to this. I don't want to listen to this. Just go away. And then I finally listened to it and kind of took over my life for a little while. I am thankfully past the point where I just listen to it ad nauseum all day, every day, but it was pretty aggressive. Just ask my boyfriend, who felt like he needed earplugs. Not because he dislikes it, but because anything on repeat after a while starts feeling like torture. But because I am me, and because I had heard such great things about Ron Chernow's Hamilton biography that was based on this, and I couldn't get enough of Hamilton everything, I was watching documentaries on YouTube, whatever. Anyway, I decided to read the book. And as I was reading Ron Chernow's Alexander Hamilton, I realized that I did not know a lot about the history of the political system in our country. And, part of that is because in school I never cared about American history. I always wanted to learn about history of ancient Egypt or China or Japan or anything else. But in our current situation here in America, it seemed to me that it would be a really, really interesting idea to learn more about our political system and its evolution. I also needed more nonfiction biographies to listen to. I listen to audiobooks a lot at this point. It's a very new thing for me, about a year or so of listening to them, but I only like to listen to nonfiction on audio, and at this point I had gone through every non-American history book, it felt like, in the Overdrive app from multiple libraries in my area. So I was looking for something new. I was looking for something that would engage me. And so I decided to do a presidential biography reading challenge for myself. No time limit, just I wanted to listen to a biography on every single United States president. This was a mistake. I started this a while ago and I posted about it on Instagram. And I was like, I'll make a video about it sometime soon. And then I never did because my life was a mess. So here's a video now, the first one. And I'm going to break this up a little bit and talk about some different biographies that I've been reading. I try not to overload every video, but in case you're curious what the criteria are for the biographies that I'm reading, it's just that they are on audio, if possible, because I'm commuting now. I need the audiobook, and that they are positive about the president in question. I tried listening to a couple that were negative, and those were super biased. I like the ones that pretend they're not biased, and then I get to pick through them. And also what I find is that, especially later on, when Democrats and Republicans are trading off more evenly of the presidency, I get some of that, like, more retrospective from the other side of the president. But I wanted to see what that was like. And here we are. There are some presidents that I probably won't be listening to a straight biography about them because I feel like I know more about them, like JFK or Abraham Lincoln. I wanted to do some biographies with some of the other more well-known presidents that would be more of a different take on them than what I had heard before. I also was going to try to do it in order, but that fell apart pretty quickly in the beginning. I'm back to trying to make that work, but the struggle is that, especially when you hit some of the lesser well-known earlier presidents, there's not any audiobooks on them, so I'll have to go back and fill in holes later. So we'll see how that goes. Right now, according to my fancy list, I have listened to biographies on George Washington, John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison. James Monroe has been really, really hard to find, so I skipped him. John Quincy Adams, Andrew Jackson, and then I could not find a single audiobook on Martin Van Buren William Henry Harrison, John Tyler, and so now I'm listening to one about James K. Polk because that was the next guy that I could find. And then I also think there's this huge gap here as well. I did listen to my Abraham Lincoln already, and I did listen to my Ulysses S. Grant because I wanted to read the Chernow. And I have technically listened to my Harry Truman and my Lyndon B. Johnson, but those were two of the first ones on my list, and they were not true biographies. They were different takes, so I might go back and redo that. And then I listened to a hella long one on FDR, which was a traditional biography that was crazy. I've also listened to some notable supplement books, which I'll maybe talk about in another episode. One of them being Alexander Hamilton, the sad, sad thing that started this. I should note that this project is indebted to Josh from Literary Gladiators, who showed me this website from someone who decided to do a much more in-depth version of what I'm doing right now, where they went through every president and read upwards of like 3 biographies per president, and it took them years. It's a website about the best presidential biographies. I'll link to it down in the description, but this person is crazy, and this took them years, but it's been a really helpful resource to me when I can't find biographies on particular presidents sometimes. So for today, I'd like to do micro reviews on the first 6 presidents in the chronological list, not necessarily the list that I read them in. I'm really mad about James Monroe right now because he's like this glaring issue in the middle, and I don't know why. But for my George Washington pick, I read Washington, A Life by Ron Chernow. This was not an accident. By the time I got around to Washington, I had already listened to Hamilton, obviously, and I really, really loved Chernow's writing style, and Washington is the one that he won the super big award for. Although I have to say that I didn't find Washington as interesting as Hamilton, and that's quite possibly because Washington wasn't as interesting as Hamilton. Alexander Hamilton, is crazy. That's why he's a hip-hop musical. But it was good. It was solid. I felt like I learned a lot more, especially about Washington's early career, before he became the general that's on everything, everywhere in America. And Chernow was very good at bringing out the negatives as well as the positive qualities. I feel like Washington has become this godlike figure who could do no wrong, and obviously that's not the case. He had problems, he could have a temper, he owned slaves, which is the one that we're more likely to grapple with. But anyway, it was solid, it was good, it didn't really wow me, and it was one of the ones that I feel like I took away the least from, because I'm trying to recall like one interesting fact that I learned, and nothing's coming to mind. But it's solid, it's a good place to start, and I highly recommend it. For my John Adams, I listened to John Adams by David McCullough, and this was the first David McCullough book that I've ever read or listened to, and I've just heard so many amazing things about him, and I feel like he's like half the U.S. history section in Barnes & Noble. So I was really fascinated to listen to this book and see how that would go. But the audiobook narrator on this one almost killed me. I didn't like the narrator, and all I could think of was Lin-Manuel Miranda singing, "Shut up, John!" You know the rest. And so those two things coupled, sometimes I would just get really lost and I would lose track of the narrator because I didn't like his voice. I also found it interesting how much McCullough depends on excerpts of letters or things that Adams wrote. And in the beginning I wasn't so sure about it because sometimes it felt like there were just strings of narrative tying together things from letters. But as I continued on into the audiobook, it really seemed like it was bringing out John Adams's real voice, and it didn't feel like something that David McCullough had written. It felt like John Adams was being illuminated to me through framework. And so while I was not super excited in the beginning, and it took me a while to really get started on this one, I was in the end, really loving Michaela's writing style. And half the reason I want to revisit Truman is because one of Michaela's great books is considered his Truman biography, and I'd like to maybe feel that same way. And the thing that I read for Truman that I have written down is not a biography, it's something else. I also felt like this biography was important for me because I learned so much more about John Adams, who's really one of the founding fathers that we don't hear as much about. So I highly recommend that one as well. If you are at all interested, just either stick it out for the narrator or read the book. For Thomas Jefferson, I felt obligated to read John Meacham's The Art of Power because it's like the first book anywhere, everywhere that comes up when you search Thomas Jefferson. But oh my god, I have this issue with how Thomas Jefferson is talked about, and in a way he seems more godlike in some respects than even George Washington, and that's how this book felt. It was just like, oh, the great sage of Monticello, and it was so hyperbolic, and Jefferson could do no wrong, and listen. It was not like John Meacham didn't talk about Sally Hemings, or didn't talk about the fact that he owned slaves, or didn't talk about the fact that in a lot of respects Thomas Jefferson is a walking, talking contradiction, but it just felt so venerative. Is that a word? I don't think it's a word, and I don't know how else to tell you this. It just felt so over the top, and just like I wanted a biography that would just give me his life and illuminate him for me. And I just kept thinking, like, there was just so much tonal imposition from John Meacham into how I should think about Thomas Jefferson. But then I went to watch a documentary about Thomas Jefferson, like 3 of them, and they all talked about him the same way, and I was just like, no, not super interested. I find him a fascinating person, but I feel like we're only really just starting to do scholarship that doesn't talk about him like this. Maybe, if we're lucky. For James Madison, I read A Life Reconsidered by Lynn Cheney. This was interesting because I had no idea how influential James Madison really was as a founding father. You always hear about, George Washington, John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, but he was the 4th president of the United States, and he was there for everything that Washington, Jefferson, and Adams, and in fact probably more than Jefferson in the beginning of America, and was just so influential, and had epilepsy, which I did not know, and he did so many things that I feel like in my overview of American history from school we didn't hear about. We don't hear about him. We don't hear about his influence with Washington. We don't hear about his influence on Jefferson, especially Jefferson's presidency. And even the John Meacham biography on Jefferson didn't really mention Madison. And so I felt like, even though the book was only so-so in terms of execution, that he was somebody that I really needed to learn about. And that's also why I'm mad that I can't find something good on James Monroe, because I feel like I might have the same reaction to him because he and James Madison had such an interesting relationship. So we'll circle back to James Monroe eventually, hopefully. The John Quincy Adams biography that I read was called The Lost Founding Father by William Cooper Jr. And I was confused by that title when I picked it up, but after I read it, it totally made sense. John Quincy Adams really was the president over a changing of the guard, where he was really the last person to have an intimate connection with the founding fathers, and Andrew Jackson comes after him, who I'll talk about in a second. And so he was like this really interesting relic almost, even when he was elected president, of a time past and a time that he was kind of refusing to move forward. And what I really, really love about this biography is that I felt like I understood John Quincy Adams. It really gave credence to what he did as an ambassador, what he did as Secretary of State, and then what he did as president. But whereas most of these other biographies like focus on the presidency, and then there's like this brief brief little portion at the end about like they retired and then they died and this is some of their everlasting thoughts and whatever. It focused, like half the book was on his life after the presidency because he only served one term and then he went back to serve in the House of Representatives, and he's the only president to have done that. And this is crazy. Like his life after the presidency, he didn't just decide to retire like a lot of the other people. He said, I still have a duty to my country and I still want to be involved in public service, and even if nobody will let me do anything else, I have a strong voice and I have strong opinions and I want to be a part of this government. And I mean, he was involved in so much stuff in the US House of Representatives, and so the fact that he's like this little blip in the presidency saga is so sad because yes, he wasn't a great president. What he did afterward is so important, and nobody else has that. So if you're interested in a book that kind of tackles that and takes that on and really teaches you stuff you didn't know before, I do really recommend that biography. Last but not least in this installment, we're going to talk about my Andrew Jackson biography, which was John Meacham's American Lion. And I was so wary about this biography after my Thomas Jefferson experience because I wasn't sure like if it was just the subject matter or the top, like is it Meacham or is it Jefferson? Like where is the issue that I was having with that book? And this one was much different. It really showed me that John Meacham is capable of writing a book that I enjoy. It didn't blow me out of the water, but Andrew Jackson is such a crazy character that is kind of like Alexander Hamilton. You're just kind of listening and going, what? What? And Andrew Jackson is so important to understand because if John Quincy Adams was the end of an era, then Andrew Jackson is the start of a new one with more party politics, with more popular vote emphasis, and less governmental control of the presidential election. Really fascinating and just a really crazy character, and much more worthwhile than the Meacham Jefferson one, I feel, but I'm biased. And really gets into more of his vices and his foibles and how Andrew Jackson was this crazy guy who had a lot of strong opinions but didn't execute a ton of things really well. And also makes me angry that I can't find something on Martin Van Buren right now because Martin Van Buren is the father of party politics and he was very involved in Andrew Jackson's stuff, and he deserves more from me and I cannot give it to him currently. Like I said, I had to skip Martin Van Buren, William Henry Harrison, John Tyler. I just lucked out with getting something about James K. Polk, but like, this annoys me. He was only president for 63 days, so whatever, but I'm still curious. And John Tyler was the first vice president to become president, and I feel like there's interesting things to learn there. So maybe I'll cycle back around to them. Otherwise, when this kicks up in an episode 2, I'll talk about some of the later biographies that I've done, and also some of my notable supplements, which I also have some fun thoughts and feelings about. So eventually, episode 2 will show up when I have more to say. And hopefully you find this interesting. I know I do. And sorry, my refrigerator turned on. That's life. Thanks, guys.